While Turing's setting us up, let me introduce. This is Dr. Nick Touran. He is in the employ of an advanced reactor maker, and he does not represent his employer today. He makes the excellent website whatisnuclear.com. I am so fortunate to have him in my social circle and have him available to to bring to you. I do what I can to help out Nick and the Friends of Fission. That's the Seattle Friends of Fission. That's our organization where we talk to locals and we try to spread the message about how critical our nuclear infrastructure is. And in Washington, let me give you a very brief history. We have a 1.1 gigawatt nuclear reactor. That's a boiling water reactor just across the street from the Hanford weapons factory that and this is called Columbia Generating Station. It is owned by the public. It is owned by me, Nick, everyone around here through a network of 27 public utility districts. And there's an unfortunate history that we had a fight where corrupt contractors and NIMBYs sort of almost imploded our entire nuclear infrastructure in Washington. We salvaged one reactor, and I think we need to build on that.
Thank you for giving me some of your time today, Dr. Touran. How would you like me to call you?
Yeah, you can just call me Nick.
Okay, wonderful. So we have Karl on one side, your environment Seattle. We have Dr. Nick Touran down on the bottom, and I'm your host, Brad Wydra, or Touring News. And yeah, really thank you. This is not exactly my field of expertise, so it's wonderful that you're giving some of your time here. We have maybe like 50 viewers in the channel, and hopefully they'll be asking in some questions. I did watch your hour and a half video that you did in the library. It was very wonderful. I also watched your 15-minute speech that you did in the other place. That was not as wonderfully received. Those people, they did not like you at all.
No, it's the Seattle lifestyle.
Yeah, they weren't going for your jokes. They weren't going for your your take on how like coal did get us here. Like, yes, it has problems now, but like look at all the benefits that it's been. Has anything changed since, I guess that was in when was that one that you gave, or when were those speeches? I think earlier this year.
The let's see, the one that was well received was earlier this year, or actually it was, when was that, Karl? It was like
2019.
2019.
Yeah, it was when Yang was still in it, and right after Warren dropped out. Or no, that was after Warren flipped anti-nuclear.
Okay. Yeah, no, the other one was it was like 2 years ago, the one at the brewery, so 2018 or so. I haven't been doing too many talks very recently, but I would say that I don't think it hasn't really changed much in Seattle. Like, people are, depending on exactly what your audience is, many people are interested and open, and everyone's skeptical at first. Some people are more open to hearing some of the information, and others aren't. It's usually enjoyable. I haven't been like screamed at too many times, so.
So I like the way that you kind of instead of talking about like next gen nuclear, you kind of just use like thorium as your blanket, for going through this. So could you just give like a little bit of maybe like a quick TLDR of why you think the future would be moving towards thorium based generation rather than the uranium based at the moment?
Let's see. Do I do that? I've kind of positioned myself as I sort of have been trying to correct some of the misinformation about thorium out there while still being excited about it. I don't necessarily think thorium is going to be the nearest term nuclear future. I kind of think like I think the fastest way to decarbonize more now with nuclear technology is to continue using the uranium infrastructure that we have in place today. I'm not opposed to thorium. The only thing I'm opposed to about thorium is that there's a lot of just outright incorrect information that people will say about thorium that's just wrong. So that's one thing that I try to. On the other hand, thorium gets people really excited, and so like for instance, Andrew Yang was talking about thorium, in front of millions of people at the Democratic debate, which has actually helped bring a lot of people who are nuclear curious. People have become curious about nuclear because of thorium, and I find that super powerful and valuable. But thorium itself isn't technically, it really isn't much superior to uranium. What people tend to do is they say, like, there's current nuclear and there's thorium. But in reality, there's current nuclear and there's all of the advanced other nuclear stuff. They could use uranium, could use thorium, could use whatever fuel. It's just different types of reactors, low pressure coolants, higher temperatures, blah, blah. So I'll stop in a second. But so in terms of the future, like, I think we should be building current generation reactors, ABWRs, APR 1400s, as fast as possible to decarbonize, because decarbonizing is essential. And those reactors are ready to rock. They're fully licensed and people are building them today. So we need those like crazy. And then at some point, if and almost only if we do start building, thousands of nuclear plants, then we need to switch over to some advanced nuclear technologies, which have the billion-year sustainability features and they have the enhanced safety characteristics.
As far as for organization of how our conversation goes, I am 100% happy to just give mostly you and Karl the platform. And if there's if there's going to be a question that Karl wants to bring up that can give in to you, because some of mine are going to be a little bit more basic, but I'll try to maybe put one here that I think was something that was alerted to me. So we're currently on third generation reactors. Is this?
Yes, third and 3+ is another term used, but yes, third generation is where we're at.
I saw in a paper somewhere that when shifted or advanced into a fourth generation reactor, something about the added efficiency into it allows you to do another type of power generation at the facility as well, because you're not going to be losing as much into the heat. So could you explain what it would be now at the moment with the third generation, and then what would change going into the fourth generation?
So electricity is about 40% of the world's total energy use. Things are lights and whatever electric appliances we have. That's like 30 or 40% of our total energy. The rest is transportation. That's oil going to cars and trucks and airplanes, and then industrial heat. So the stuff that makes concrete and steel and chemicals and does recycling and whatever industrial process, there's always like a natural gas boiler in there, hammering out some industrial material. And that takes a ton of energy. And so to be able to do transportation with some low carbon energy source, the best option is to just use electric cars and increase the share of electricity, get rid of oil, go to electric cars. That can be done with any type of reactor, anything that makes electricity. So you can use a current generation or an advanced reactor to decarbonize the transportation sector, at least cars. Airplanes is a bit harder, but it can maybe be done. Now, when you go to the industrial process stuff, they generally need quite high temperatures. So 500 Celsius, and actually usually higher than that, 700, even 1,000 Celsius for some things like concrete and steel. And to get to those temperatures is quite challenging. You can't go to those temperatures with the current generation water-cooled reactor. They go to 300 something Celsius, and they just can't get up there because for various reasons related to the steam cycle. So some advanced reactors, which use higher temperature coolants, whether that be sodium metal, or some other liquid metal, or a molten salt, can go to even higher temperatures. And then there's gas-cooled reactors, which can go to like crazy high temperatures, even up to 1,000 Celsius. So there's one high-temperature gas-cooled reactor in Japan that can go to 1,000 Celsius. And those reactors then are capable of reaching that whole industrial process heat sector.
So when you say cooled by gas power or something, would this still require water then as any part of the coolant system of it?
Well, so some advanced reactors still use a steam ranking cycle. So for instance, there's a relatively, well, we've built handfuls of them. These liquid metal cooled reactors usually have high temperature liquid metal around 500 Celsius that then transfers its heat to a steam generator, which does have water in it, which makes steam and then spins a turbine. So that does have water in it. But other types, when you go to even higher temperatures, you can start using something called Brayton cycle, which is what a combined cycle natural gas plant uses. So it's more of a jet engine. And in that case, you probably still have water, to cool the condenser or the recuperators or whatever, but it's not as much of a thing. And you can also do something called dry cooling when you're at high temperatures, which is where you just start cooling basically with air from the atmosphere, at which point then you don't need a bunch of water.
Interesting. So the biggest reason that I was asking this is because some of my friends say one of the problems with nuclear at the moment is it requires a water source, and the water sources are heating up because of climate change. So can you like is kind of what you're saying of moving into these like next generation areas going to mitigate some of that
Yeah.
like inefficiency that would be done? Because if your water's too hot, then you need it's harder to cool and so on and so forth. So I'll let you go from there. Oh, or Carl, yeah.
Yeah, Carl.
Well, I just have to call out, this BS that nuclear is ultra inefficient when the water temperature increases. When you look at the rating for your solar panel, solar goes down in efficiency when it gets hotter. Wind and weather patterns change as it gets hotter. So I'll just start with that. That basically, it it is like weather changing conditions are universal for energy sources unless that energy source is gas. That gas is the only one that directly combusts and doesn't use this it does use thermal transfer as a boosted efficiency, but it's the only one that is less impacted by weather changes. And I don't like the idea of a future powered by natural gas or fossil gas.
Can you just turn your mic down a tiny bit, if you don't mind? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
No. This is I am just a person who is here. You're both the experts. So after you.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Carl. I think that's an important point. But yeah, certainly like water usage is something that we all are concerned about as climate change happens and water resources become more constrained. So there's a couple sides of the story. So on one hand, the thermal efficiency, which is how much of the heat is converted to electricity in a nuclear plant, is relatively low. So it's like 33-ish, 34% of the heat becomes electricity. And so some of the advanced reactors, which when you go to a higher temperature reactor, you can actually convert more of your heat to electricity. It's just a thermodynamics thing. So you can get up into the 45% thermal efficiency. And that right there cuts your water usage by a huge amount. So that's one advantage of advanced reactors in terms from a water perspective. The other one is, if you go to a gas Brayton cycle or a direct cooling, non-water, a dry cooling type situation, which is much more cost effective if you're at very high temperature, then you're going to cut your water usage as well. And that's enabled by some of these high temperature advanced reactors. And then lastly, I would say another thing that people have proposed through the years, I can't remember, was it John F. Kennedy at one point was proposing using huge, massive amounts of clean nuclear energy to desalinate water from the oceans and turn. They were talking about it. This is in the like neo-colonialism days. They were talking about basically turning the whole Middle East into like a luscious paradise by using decarbonized or desalinated water from big nuclear reactors to basically for the purpose of causing peace, helping peace in the Middle East by making there be lots of land that's like very fertile that everybody wants to live in rather than just like smaller areas. So like if you have abundant, cheap, carbon-free energy, you can make as much water as you want by desalinating water. So that's kind of the.
I kind of, I mean, this is off topic, but I've seen some bad things about desalination lately, where for every 1 liter of clean water that they produce, they're producing like 1.5 liters of brine water, and then when they're dumping the brine back into the ocean, due to the different density of it, it just sinks down to the bottom, and it oversalinates the bottom of the ocean, and then it's kind of like killing like the floor of it. And they don't exactly at the moment have a good way to deal with this brine water. I was watching on like Bloomberg or CNBC or some of these things.
That needs to be dealt with as well. They also are burning like bunker fuel to desalinate water in Saudi Arabia. Like it's the dirtiest fossil fuel imaginable, and that's what they're using right now. So it's bad from that perspective as well.
Maybe my final question about the 3rd gen versus the 4th gen. So you did say that you're of the moment right now where let's take the proven technology that we have, let's come up with one plant, and then let's pretty much mass produce that plant.
Yeah.
How far are we into the future from shifting from this 3rd gen to the 3.5 gen to the 4th gen?
Well, it really depends on. from a technology readiness level, we could start building certain 4th generation reactors like really soon, like 5 years type time frames. Like we've built. Oh, go ahead, Carl.
Oh, I was going to say, Nick's not going to brag about this. He's been doing exactly this for 10 years. So he's going to be couching whatever he says in, forward-leaning FTC rule trading. But he's got the real view of it.
For better or worse, yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, it's really a matter of, like, so right now, India and China are both building what are considered 4th generation reactors. They're under construction. They'll be and Russia is operating several liquid metal cooled 4th generation reactors. So like they're here right now. And in terms of like deploying them at scale, that's just a question of when are they going to become, like when are people going to be able to confidently deliver them for a price that competes with whatever the alternative is right now. And so at the moment in the US, the alternative that the utilities are looking at is fracked natural gas. Natural gas plants are cheap. Natural gas fuel is cheap. Never mind that it's very high carbon. They're building them like crazy. And so right now, and they're almost impossible to compete with on a capital cost perspective. And so until somebody decides that they don't want carbon in their atmosphere and put some kind of market condition on things that emit massive amounts of carbon, it's going to be challenging for any nuclear reactor to really compete in places that have, like the United States, where we have infinity natural gas.
One good thing that I would tell you is after looking through the financials of fracking, it doesn't work. They're all going to go bankrupt. It was never going to get off the ground.
Okay.
They secured their loans with the assumption that they were going to be able to sell the natural gas between $65 to $75 per barrel.
Yeah,
so they basically said, well, we're going to pull this out of the ground, and we know that it's going to make this much for us in the future. But if you look across the entire oil patch at the moment right now, they just have to keep resaddling and redoubling themselves down with debt. And I'm actually very fascinated to see what happens in 2021, because I think that you're almost going to see some of the banking sector have to take some of the oil patch over. But I feel horrible for both renewables and for nuclear, because we did buy onto this fracking thing. However, we subsidized it with what we thought would be future earnings that just are not there. And it ended up, I think, putting us, back a decade or two when we should have been moving into another way.
So I want to bring up something, Brad. You said that you went into the financials of this, and I have sort of a theory that as the price of oil falls, all of the fracked gas infrastructure is going to be, we're going to see utilities start to seek rent on that. So the price of gas is going to go up, and consequently the price of energy is going to go up.
Yeah, you could be 100% right. It's just shitty. And I heard in your thing, like, I'm kind of one of the people who says, like, the meme of how are you going to pay for it? I don't really care. We need energy. I mean, we need to get to better ways. And I've done enough reading about, balance sheets or modern monetary theory, or how, taxing and spending works, or what like the private sector of the banks get away with. So I feel terrible for you being a nuclear advocate, that you consistently have to say, like, oh, well, it's going to be profitable, or it's going to be this way, or it's going to be that way. Is there any movement toward it being somehow not for profit, or is it still really driven by, you need these big time investors, you need to get your grants and so forth?
Yeah. So, well, there isn't a lot of movement. There is one interesting project that I should mention, which is called the Open 100, which is an attempt to make basically an open source reactor design. So it's a traditional-ish reactor design, water cooled, solid fuel, but the whole design is intended to be like totally open source, and they're publishing design drawings, CAD models on their webpage. And it's made by a guy who's like an entrepreneur and mechanical engineer who did a podcast called Titans of Nuclear. And he went and interviewed all these people across the whole nuclear industry worldwide. He interviewed 300 people or something. And he came to the conclusion, based on what everyone said, that the way to make nuclear cost effective is to standardize a well-known design and just pound them out, like just make as many as you can. And he asked, like, why haven't we done that? And well, it's because every company has their own specialized design and they want to sell theirs. And so there's like a profit motive to not standardize and make your own thing. And so he said, okay, forget it. I'm just going to make an open source version, and that'll solve the whole problem. And I don't know, there's still huge complications in like getting a pump vendor or a heat exchanger vendor to like sign on to that. There has to be some, not everybody's going to just be in it for the good of the energy world. Like people are going to want to still
Right.
make a profit. And so how that exactly is going to work, I don't know. But that's the only thing I can think of that's like a major turn away from the tradition.
And we saw this happen precisely in Washington State, where the Washington public power system had essentially a public mandate to build out energy because of the oil crisis, and so the vendors rushed in and tried to make a buck every place they could, and they did participate in regulatory capture, and then the public reacted negatively to that because there wasn't enough transparency, there wasn't enough, upfront sharing of the costs and benefits, and so when it fell apart, it crashed horribly. And when it comes to the public ownership of energy infrastructure, that's something I really wish that the political left would take on headfirst, because we have transportation, healthcare, and housing, which are incredibly important issues that the left is focusing on, that we need to do everything we can to make a base public good out of these needs. And why don't we do that with energy? Why do we live in this ANCAP fantasy land where everyone has their own Tesla battery and Tesla solar panels, and is an island to yourself for energy, but we live in a society when it comes to healthcare, transportation, and everything else?
Yeah, I wish that they would do it too. I'm imagining that one of the reasons that it's not as often discussed is because we already all get called communists who just want to nationalize everything and not allow anything to be on the private market. And I think inside the mind of most Americans, they can't fathom a way that like you don't have to have a for-profit oil sector. You don't have to have a for-profit nat gas sector. Like you see all the pushback even of just looking at what you could say a Green New Deal or even Medicare for all or some of these things. Like you said, the nature of the United States of thinking, okay, market reigns supreme has been, fed to us through so many different levels of education, that when you do have people coming up to try to talk, like you said, even public ownership. I try to use the word public ownership over nationalization because I think that it speaks much better. But then you immediately have people just say like, oh, you're just one of those other like bloody commies. And we really have to learn the language in order to be able to do this. And I think it's a great point that you bring up.
Yeah. So we'll let Nick answer all these wonderful questions as he helps us solve the problem while we're still under the thumb of capitalism.
I did have two others before going to all the ones that just came through here.
Cool.
So can you explain what a modular reactor actually is, or like what are some of the differences between?
Yeah. Sure. So when you go and build a reactor, like a big reactor out in the field, it's done in a way that's kind of called stick built, where like, equipment comes in and you kind of assemble it on the site, and you weld things onto it and pipe hangers, and you're pouring concrete, and you're like embedding in all this equipment into the concrete as you're going, and you're then you're measuring it and inspecting it, and there's regulators who come and make sure it's all correct and blah, blah, and it goes on for years and years as you're building a plant. So the concept of a modular reactor or modular construction is you build a module of a particular part of the reactor with all of its different pieces already attached in a factory of some kind, whether maybe a big factory like in a shipyard, and then you barge ship it to the site, and then they just like use a crane to drop that module in and maybe connect a couple things to it. But it's the idea is you have a much more controlled environment in a factory. You have people who live there year round. They aren't like living in some labor camp out in wherever the site happens to be. So you have like increased quality control, and you have better like an economy of mass production. Think of it like a Henry Ford assembly line type thing. And then so you just bring modules in instead of constructing it all on the site. So then big reactors do certainly have some modular construction these days. Like the AP1000 has modules that come in, and it doesn't always work how you think. Like sometimes they brought modules in and they didn't fit together, and they had to like tear it down and rebuild it. So that actually caused cost increases in some of the big construction projects. But with a small modular reactor, you can build like a lot more, all the way up to like the whole reactor in a factory, and then you just like really make sure it all works, and then maybe you can like deliver it to its site and get it going. And so again, it's just it's an idea of achieving economies of mass production is the hope of a factory produced or a modular reactor.
Okay, and there was just one more big one that I wanted to ask, and then we'll get through some of the other ones over here. So I heard you mention that there were nuclear-powered submarines that were developed in the 1950s, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So two questions: how, if a nuclear facility on, let's just say Earth, like on land, why do they need to be so large that? But then you can actually just build like a very small one inside of a submarine. And then the follow-up question would be, is there a big opportunity? So I've been looking at how they're trying to change either hydrogen fuel power for cross-ocean shipping. Should the shipping industry be trying to consider moving towards more nuclear power? And if so, is there any type of problem? We just saw the oil tanker in, I think it was in Malaysia, just came up onto like a coral reef, breached, and then, it leaked everywhere. So the questions would be, how can you build one so small? Should the shipping industry be going towards that? And what would happen if like a big freight ship crashed into something? Is there like a potential contamination?
Okay, great questions. So let's see. So first of all, yeah, you can build. They're relatively small. They're still pretty high power in those submarines. They're several 100 million watts. For battleship or you're going into battle, you want a lot of power. So, but yeah, they're very small and they fit in submarines. The first power plants we built on land were like that size or smaller. We started very small. The first chain reactor that humans made was under a squash court in Chicago. But we started making them bigger because of the pressure of economies of scale. So it turns out that if you build a nuclear plant that is twice as big as the previous one, it doesn't cost twice as much. And so, but you can get twice as much revenue from it because it makes 2 times the amount of watts. So you get 2 times the amount of dollars per second. And so that economy of scale has pushed nuclear reactors to get bigger and bigger and bigger, just purely for economic reasons. And they basically reached parity with coal in the 70s at roughly the size they're at today, and they've kind of coasted around the billion-watt scale. So it's just, you can absolutely build very small nuclear reactors. It's just more expensive per kilowatt. Okay. So now, in terms of shipping, it's been there is one operational nuclear powered merchant ship. It's in Russia. That. It's called the Sevmoput or something like that. They also have nuclear powered icebreakers that use small water cooled reactors, very similar to the power plants. They work great. They use those icebreakers go up into the North Pole. One of them just went to the North Pole like yesterday. They can go to really incredible places. And should the shipping industry be considering it's purely economics. In Atoms for Peace in the 50s, we built a beautiful merchant nuclear powered ship called the NS Savannah. It's in a museum to this very day, like in Baltimore. I think it's in Baltimore. You can go visit it. But it was intended to like take over shipping, but it was more expensive than just burning bunker fuel. It was, you had to have highly trained operators. There was maintenance costs. And so the cost of it was just higher than running on fossil fuel. So again, we get into like market conditions. Right. I think it's totally appropriate for like big ships can totally decarbonize. It's totally appropriate to put nuclear reactors in those things and move them around. But you get into both costs. You have to make sure you can make them and operate them cheaply. And then the other issue is just public perception. That Russian merchant ship is not allowed in any international port outside of Russia and Antarctica. Those are the 2 places it can go. So people have come up with concepts for like there's a nuclear powered ocean faring tugboat that like tugs a huge container ship, and then the nuclear ship stays out at sea well, a fossil powered
Interesting.
thing takes it into the population zone.
What
Um,
what would
but
happen if one of them wrecked? Like, let's say, what could be like the, sorry to ask you this
well,
one, but what would be the worst
yeah.
case scenario
The
of it?
you can't ask an engineer the worst case scenario, because yeah, I mean you have to consider like what's the likelihood of a scenario and stuff like that. But I mean, so let's see if one of the big challenge with nuclear accidents is that somehow the fuel doesn't have enough cooling, and so it heats up and melts, and the radioactive particles disperse into the ocean or the atmosphere, and then people breathe them or drink them, and it hurts them. So, but when you're at sea, you have an interesting situation where you have a vast abundance of cooling. So it's really challenging to like run out of cooling water when you're in the ocean, and so there have been major accidents in nuclear powered submarines. The Scorpion and what's the other one? The Thresher are two nuclear powered submarines that went down, all lost all men, great tragedies. And to this day, although maybe some of it's been recovered, there hasn't been a single bit of radiation detected leaking out of those totally destroyed submarines at the bottom of the ocean. Now, the Russians have had accidents in their nuclear-powered submarines as well, and I think some of those did actually leak a little bit of radiation. But when you're, nothing, I don't want to it's the
Let me butt
frequency.
in.
Yeah, go ahead. I was
I'll
going to
butt
say
in.
delusion.
Let me put this in scale. We detonated 530 atomic weapons in our atmosphere. That's the source of like 90% of the radionuclide contamination on the planet came from weapons, and about 5% came from medical isotopes, which save lives. So put it in scale. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the worst case scenario is like you have a radiological incident and radionuclides go places. But if you're in the ocean, like the likelihood of those, even a relatively large release in a non-populated area, the likelihood of that causing a death or a cancer death, going above some threshold that like is going to hurt somebody is pretty low. And I think if you compare it to the air pollution of the fossil fuel fleet, I think you could probably, I haven't done the calculation on that, but I assume you'll find out that the nuclear ones, even if you assume a certain frequency of nuclear accidents, it's still going to end up being safer than the combustion-based ones.
I liked your way of talking about the data where it's around 4 million people that die per year from air pollution.
8 million.
Oh,
It's
eight.
yeah,
Oh,
four from fossil and 4 from biofuel.
Okay, there you go. And that doesn't even count in how it's exacerbating climate problems, climate changes, stronger storm systems, and so forth. So here comes the big question that everybody is going to ask you, and I'm sure that everybody asks you. So at the moment right now, I saw your video. You had the 30. It was one half of 33 years of nuclear waste, and then eventually you take it and you, I guess, hopefully you bury it under the ground.
Yeah.
Does this seem to be the long-term strategy for waste storage?
So I recently redirected the URL whataboutthewaste.com to my nuclear waste website that goes through the story because it's such a common question and rightly so. It's an important issue.
I think this is the only thing that really the only things that hold it back to me are the NIMBYs who don't want it around, the people who are afraid that it's going to melt down, and then the people that say, well, we have to store this for 100,000 years, yet we are a chronically unstable civilization.
Right.
So go ahead.
Yeah. Some toxins like mercury are toxic forever, and so I don't fully understand the concept of a toxin that gets less dangerous with time. That's very unique. Only nuclear gets less toxic with time compared to other industrial toxins, which are toxic forever, yet we dispose of them, and I never hear anything about them being dangerous. But anyway, radiation has a special place as a toxin in people's minds, so I get it. So there's a couple options, and there's different camps in the nuclear world. Some people will say, well, that's not waste at all. That's an energy resource, and we should recycle it and use it to power the world. And that's actually based in reality. You can do that if you use these fast neutron breeder reactors with full recycling. You actually can get massive amounts of energy out of the nuclear waste that we've already produced today without mining another thing. In fact, the high-level nuclear waste we have in the U.S., I've done them. It depends what assumptions you do, but it can power the whole country for hundreds of years. which is pretty impressive. So there is a lot. And then when you do recycle the fuel, it actually turns into a waste that can decay away after 500 or 1,000 years rather than 100,000 years, which is much more. It's still a long time, but it's like you can almost believe that you could sort of keep track of something for that long. Now, the problem with that is that it's expensive. You have to build a bunch of reprocessing plants. You have to build a bunch of fast neutron exotic reactors, and those things are all a little bit more expensive. And right now, when we have nuclear struggling economically, it's just not a good time to start doing that, in my opinion. And so I would say that the geologic disposal, which is just take it and put it in a stable rock formation or a salt formation, is totally appropriate. It's a very small amount of waste, and we have geologic evidence, and the geologists who talk to us about that stuff, can say, well, that's the water in this salt hasn't moved more than like a centimeter in the last 10 million years, and here's how we know that. And so if you put the waste here, it's guaranteed to be isolated, no matter what, until it's completely benign. And then there's a similar story for crystalline bedrock, which is a little bit more common around the world. So like Finland has been constructing a crystalline bedrock repository called Onkalo for the last couple of years. And that thing, they're doing test drills, and that thing is going to become operational. I'm not sure exactly when, but it's probably going to be the first commercial long-term nuclear waste repository. And they just did it. They said, okay, we have this waste. Even if you hate nuclear power, if you're so afraid of nuclear power that it's going to kill everybody, you should want to take the waste and put it deeply out of the biosphere. Like, we've already created a bunch of waste. So I feel like everybody should be able to get on board with safe disposal of nuclear material. But it's not the case. There are people who will just oppose any and all efforts to study or do work on nuclear waste disposal, which is sort of unfortunate. Like, how cynical do you have to be to say, like, oh, it's so dangerous, don't even study it? That drives me crazy. But anyway, so yeah, I think the physics beauty of nuclear power, E equals mc squared, gives you this 2 million times more energy in a kilogram of nuclear fuel than in a kilogram of any chemical fuel, fossil fuel, or lithium, or whatever. And so you have 2 million times more energy, and so you have 2 million times less waste per amount of energy that you pull out. And that is so astounding that allows, even though it's pretty concentrated toxic stuff, the environmental impact of like a factor of 2 million is just astounding. And so you have that much you're just impacting the whole environment that much less. And the fact that it's dangerous, like, yeah, you can put it in an isolated geologic repository, and it's not, I mean, I can't find, I'm going on a rant here, I have never seen a peer-reviewed study that suggests that stored commercial nuclear waste has injured anybody, much less killed anybody. And so, like, we're sitting here like wringing our hands about something that doesn't seem to be hurting people, that we have pretty good control over and we have perfectly fine technical solutions for. Well, fossil and biofuel are killing 8 million people per year, and we're causing climate change. It just seems crazy to me. So I don't know how to like communicate this better, but it just seems crazy.
This brings me up to another maybe way that you could use language to benefit you. Is there a way that you could take nuclear warheads and use those as energy generation to deproliferate?
That's a great question, and it's almost like a planted question. So there was a program from a 20-year program from like 1993 to 2003. Is that right? Or maybe 10 years shifted, called Megatons to Megawatts. And this program was a treaty between the United States and Russia, where Russia took highly enriched uranium that was in warheads that were pointed at United States cities during the Cold War. The Russians downblended it, turned it from highly enriched uranium back into low enriched uranium by mixing in uranium-238, and then sold to us, and then we put it in our nuclear reactors. And so fully half of the nuclear fuel in this country was provided from Soviet weapons that used to be pointed at our cities for 20 years. And so like that means 10% of the electricity in the United States came from dismantled Soviet nuclear weapons, which I think is like a beautiful thing. The weapons that were pointed at our cities were now lighting them up and powering them. It's a really kind of beautiful thing. And this is probably a bad analogy for a nuclear advocate, but I almost see nuclear reactors as like the Mount Doom of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons can be produced in nuclear reactors and they can be destroyed. Like they have to be returned to their source to be truly destroyed. It's just kind of ridiculous. I can't think of anything else that actually has that kind of a.
No, that actually makes really good sense. You know, one ring to rule them all, one ring or one bomb to rule them all. But you have to take it back to Moria to throw it back into the fire in order to defang it.
So you could, if you wanted to get rid of all the nuclear weapons in the world, you could power that. You could run nuclear reactors off of them, and you could power the fleet for a good, I don't know, probably like 20 or 30 more years or something like that. But we don't have so much nuclear weapons that we can power humanity like forever. At some point, we'd have to start either using breeder reactors or mining.
Yeah, I see that one person is, one or two people are kind of trying to ask like a national security question, and I don't think that it's like, I don't think that it's the biggest of problems because I think that they could attack the rest of the electrical grid, but we'll see what you think. Because they brought up Stuxnet, where it appears, the Israeli military got, in working with the United States, they got a little bit of a virus into, Iranian facilities and tried to gum up the works. So should we be concerned about like actual, attacks on nuclear facilities at all?
Yeah, so it's a big topic. Cybersecurity in the nuclear industry today is like a huge thing that people work on and spend tons of time. And there's all sorts of like research and various countermeasures and stuff going into it. So people are spending time and money on protecting against cyber attacks in nuclear facilities as well as other things. But it's certainly it's a concern, and it's something. It's another sort of advantage of. Well, first of all, most of the control systems in the United States fleet are all analog, hilariously, but the rest of the world is moving to digital instrumentation and control, at which point you're even more concerned about stuff like that coming in, because that Stuxnet was it was a virus for industrial controllers it was for the centrifuges, and they like spun the centrifuges beyond so they like exploded from spinning too fast, which is quite a ordeal. So yeah, you'd want to worry about that. But certainly you could I think you could probably, like, if you attack the offices of a nuclear plant and shut down the record keeping, you could cause the plant to like choose to shut down because, they have all these maintenance requirements that they need to watch. I think it'd be much more difficult to postulate like actually having the reactor do something bad. I mean, you can't, like, even an operator of a reactor who's trying to sabotage it. Sabotage has been something that's been considered, in the regulations for years and years. So there's like, it's very challenging for like a person to go in and like do something that would cause that reactor to release radionuclides. There's lots of passive automated systems and dampers that open and stuff that you just can't turn off.
Are the newer, more modern reactors? I don't have the language here, so help me, work through this. Aren't they kind of like you turn them on and then you kind of like walk away, and there's so many safety mechanisms that are built within them that like if this part goes down, then that happens, and then if that part goes, like haven't they really kind of like began to design them in a way where it's kind of all like self-contained within itself, where like the cooling rods would drop or something? Go ahead.
Yeah. So there's all sorts of systems like that, and they're in current reactors to a degree, and then the fourth generation reactors are focusing even more on them. So you have situations where like you may have a control rod that's held up by this grapple, but that grapple, there's a coupling that's magnetic that uses a Curie point magnet. So when the temperature at this point exceeds some value, the magnet just disengages and the control rod drops into the reactor. And there's nothing you can do to stop that rod from going in. Like if the temperature's going up, that rod's going in. Like you cannot stop it no matter what you try to do. And so those kind of features are, included in some of the more advanced reactors. And I mean, the advanced reactors are just more capable. Like they did a test in Idaho, 1986, 2 weeks before Chernobyl happened, so no one's ever heard of this test, but they did this crazy test on a reactor there called EBR2, where they had the control rods out and they just turned off the pumps, and they did not put the control rods in. Normally the rods would go in and shut the reactor down in a typical reactor, but in this reactor they just didn't put the rods in at all. They just assumed something crazy went wrong and the rods didn't go in, and that reactor was able to shut itself down and then enter into a natural circulation decay heat removal that would just run, that would never overheat the fuel with any human intervention at all. And so that was kind of the the first real demonstration of what we call passive safety or natural safety. That's now sort of a showcase thing that a lot of the next generation reactors are trying to have more of.
I actually grew up pretty close to a nuclear facility. I think there's one in it might be like Berwick, Pennsylvania, or somewhere around like near where I am. I'm from Mount Carmel. I'm from the coal mining
Okay.
regions of
All right.
Pennsylvania.
Is that where Shippingport was? Is that the first nuclear reactor?
I'm not sure. The only thing that
Yeah.
I do remember is when 9/11 happened, everybody kind of freaked out because they
Okay.
thought that
It
the
was probably an
plane
operating room.
might be trying to target the nuclear facility.
Well, yeah.
So everybody kind of like there was like a huge panic, and that
Yeah.
was like that. But yeah, I grew up like near nuclear, and it was kind of always just
Yeah.
I didn't really think much about it, I would say.
Yeah, me too. There was a plant that's like 9 miles from where I grew up, just running along.
So we're kind of getting, I mean, we still have like 10, 15 minutes left or so.
Yeah.
Karl, did you see any questions out of the chat that you wanted to bring forward? Do you have like a way that you'd like to steer it?
Well, I think it's important to talk in broad terms about the separation of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. We have to, I'll take it back to the beginning where Lisa Meitner, a woman working in Germany, was one of the early, she was the one passed over for the Nobel Prize explaining fission. And she had to actually escape Nazi Germany, and then they tried to recruit her for the Manhattan Project, where she refused. So this is one of the discoverers of fission, who was a Jewish pacifist, and when she saw that we had used her discovery to attack Japan with an atomic weapon, she was horrified. And she had some really poignant words about you can't blame me for what these war technicians have done, and I want everyone to really think about that when it comes to separating the good that this technology can do with the evil that is being done. And in fact, the IAEA, that's our International Atomic Energy Agency, is incredibly important in monitoring things like Iran, like the UAE and their plant, so that we know when a civil program is straying too close to a weapons program. And Iran is a big deal because they have one thing very different from UAE, and that is the ability to centrifuge uranium. And so then when people in chat were asking about Stuxnet, that was the US and Israel's joint operation to disrupt Iran's weapons program. And so we literally infected their computer system to spin their centrifuges too high, too hot, and break down the bearings and break down that process. So they could not produce a weapon. Since then, they've formed an agreement with the international community to exactly how they're going to produce nuclear energy without a nuclear weapons capability. And you can be very skeptical, and I think you should be very skeptical about their intentions. And that's why we need international agreements and international arrangements to monitor countries who seem to have the intent to use nuclear technology for war purposes. The other case is UAE, where they have the solid gold agreement to not refine their own uranium. They will only import uranium from other countries for nuclear fuel, and that means that nuclear fuel can't be used for bombs, and that process is highly monitored. I also think we should do that in the U.S. as much as possible. We should be on the route to disarming. We should not intermix civil plants and military and weapons production. We have one plant left in the U.S. that does that. It's Watts Bar produces tritium to maintain our nuclear weapons stockpile. And I think that people who are interested in nuclear disarmament could learn a lot from the nuclear energy industry, as I have, and I think we can get together with the energy industry and find ways of dismantling our nuclear stockpiles and disarming globally.
I wanted to actually kind of, now that you're talking about this, got a lot of thoughts on that topic. I'm not going to go into any of them. But to return to something that you did say, Nick, about the person trying to open source, the nuclear technology, is the United States going to label them a terrorist for being able to provide this type of information out to the broader community? Do you kind of see like where they could say like, oh well, you're providing the blueprint for the potential beginnings that they. So is that person scared at all about like the work that they're doing?
So I haven't asked that person that particular question.
Maybe don't. Maybe don't.
Yeah, yeah. So,
Let them do what they're doing.
So it's sort of interesting because like if you go, I like reading old nuclear documents and stuff. And when Eisenhower did this Atoms for Peace thing in 1955, it was this the United States was giving the world peaceful nuclear technology. And we gave out like just thousands and thousands of technical documents, detailed design description of the shipping port reactor, just on and on and on and on. And the idea was to like build goodwill and get people, and it'll help the nuclear industry in the United States. And it was considered at that time that like the level of information needed to like make a nuclear weapon was already, it was known to the degree necessary. And so adding information about a particular reactor just didn't move the needle on it. And so the United States at that time was very forthcoming with information. Since then, it's gotten like a little bit, I don't know if it seems more chilled. People are pretty secretive about nuclear this and that. But I have to say, from what I can tell, even the U.S. government has had no problem with these things. People have, had conversations with them about it. And as far as I can tell, and this could always change, as soon as whenever someone gets worried about it, if they have power, they can go change something. But at this point, I haven't seen like a huge pushback against that kind of thing. The U.S. government has been open sourcing lots of nuclear related software out of the national labs. Some pretty valuable and important tools you can get. And so those have all gone through elaborate export control reviews at those national labs. And the fact that they popped out, I think, is encouraging. I think they're sort of opening up to it.
I should have asked this one earlier, but I do kind of have a complex one that just came back into my mind. You talked about how like flow power and like peak power, and how at the moment right now with solar you're going to need a ton of batteries to try to store, or even with wind you might have to try to do storage or so forth. And then somebody in my community kind of asked like a decent question, and I'll see if I can frame it the way that they had it framed, because it was framed in a way to make it be a difficult one. Would the growth of nuclear, because you can't really like turn it up and turn it down and turn it up and turn it down, does it actually inhibit investment into renewables? Because you kind of like, let's say that you build a nuclear facility somewhere, you don't exactly have to like go the other route. So I'll let you take it any way that you want to.
Yeah.
Because it's a difficult one.
I mean, there is a competition. Like if you built a lot of nuclear plants, that's low carbon, then you would need less renewable. And if you built lots of intermittent renewable, you would have more renewable, obviously, but you also need more of something that can ramp up very quickly at times on demand. And so right now that's natural gas. Every big renewable installation, you'll see renewables going up like this, and you see natural gas going up, right with them.
Nat gas can fire up in about 15 minutes, where a nuclear facility is more like 24 to 36 hours. Is this?
Sounds about right. Yes, okay. It can fire up
as you were. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So and a famous climate scientist and his team, Ken Caldeira, just published a paper like yesterday. I saw it on Twitter, where they kind of did some modeling, and sure enough, there is competition between the different low carbon energy sources. So if you do build, if you like France decarbonized their whole electric grid with nuclear, and like they just don't need as much wind and solar to go the rest of the way. Like that's just a simple fact. And in terms of like the variability is like a serious problem with building out at scale. So like in the forest fires last month in California, the whole statewide solar generation was down a huge fraction, and like then in winter sun is down even bigger fraction. And so you can't just not have a backup power at those times. And to build a battery that's going to last 4 days or a week, if there's a clouds and smoke across a multi-state area, is just ridiculous. Like the amount of environmental damage that mining all that lithium and all the copper and all the transmission lines. It's just like astronomical.
So do you then think that wind seems to be the superior of the two sources? If we were only talking about wind and solar, does it kind of seem that there are less because the wind's not going to stop as much as the sun might not shine and so forth, or
well, they're different, and they're different in different regions. But
Very
like
true.
in the Pacific Northwest where I am, every January the wind goes down to almost zero for about 10 days in a row. Every December it goes to zero, and you can watch it on the Bonneville Power Administration thing. It's just so like wind. But in other places, in Wyoming, it's a much, or if you're offshore in certain places, the capacity factor is much better. So it's very region dependent, and like the sun in Arizona is much better than the sun in Ohio. So like that, the answer is like it really depends. Like if you're in Arizona, I'm pretty sure solar is probably going to end up probably being better. But just to like this concept of like, I mean, I know wind and solar are extremely popular, and they do have a lot of good things about them, but but having less of them because you have more low carbon base load that runs in the middle of winter, like, isn't a bad thing in my mind. And people will say like, oh, base load's dead. You don't need base load anymore because, the demand varies so much. But I was looking at the demand curve in California the other day, and there's 20 gigawatts of base load. Summer and winter, there will always be 20 gigawatts running constantly, and then there's like a little duck curve of demand right on top of that. It's like several gigawatts, so you're talking like up to 5 gigawatts on variable on top of 20 gigawatts of base load. And so what a perfect opportunity. Let's do nuclear for the 20 gigawatts base load. It runs all the time. That base load demand is always needed. It's perfect. And then just do wind and solar and batteries for the little jiggly thing on top. It's like a beautiful symbiosis. Like I feel like that's the most obvious and straightforward solution to the decarbonization problem.
Maybe the final one that I wanted to bring in is for maybe like a half a year, I was trying to look into the NEOM project in Saudi Arabia. Did you hear anything of the super city that they were trying to develop at all?
I didn't. I've heard of the super city, but I haven't. I'm not well acquainted.
I'll explain where I'm trying to go with the question. So they were trying to build basically like I think it was like a 10 square mile solar array or something like this, and they were hoping that they could get the energy generation and transportation to be at only like a 10% loss over like 2,500 miles, in the fact that they were going to be able to generate all of the energy in Neom, which is like in the southwestern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, and they were going to be able to become a net energy exporter out to other areas of the region. So where, I guess, like, are we in terms of would it be possible to just build like I don't know, like a nuclear state? Let's say that we take one state that doesn't have a lot of people living in it, and I'm not advocating that we're going to do this right now. Thought experiment. But we take one state, we build like 15 nuclear facilities. Would it be possible to take all of that energy out to the different sectors of the country without losing too much in the transmission?
Yeah, I mean, the transmission losses, especially with these, if you're a small area, then it's like no problem. I mean, France is not too small, but they don't lose a huge fraction of their energy to transmission. But like when you're in dispersed areas and you have a lot of solar that you have to then bring in from 100 miles out or something, then you can start worrying about losses. But some of these, the high voltage DC transmission lines are pretty efficient compared to some of the older AC ones, and they're building those things through the ocean, many thousands of kilometers, and they're losing 5% or something like that across continental distances. So the transmission losses are always going to be there to a degree, but it's not going to be debilitating in any like reasonable sized region, in my opinion.
Wonderful.
One thing you do get into with transmission though is like, if you're running on a lot of solar and wind like that's out in different places, you do have to run a lot of different transmission lines to all those individual places, because you have like a little bit of power here and a little bit over there. And so there's just footprints for transmission lines. There's NIMBYism for transmission lines. There's copper. There's mining for all the equipment that goes into it. And so you have like a material and a political footprint whenever you have to add more transmission lines. And so that's that's one reason to kind of prefer like a more centralized, very high powered energy source with like one transmission line going to where it's needed, or maybe two. But if you have to have like 50 or 100 transmission lines, to power a city, like that's just getting up there. And it won't kill you from a loss due to transmission efficiency, but it gets problematic just from these other footprint perspectives.
This is bringing us to the end of the hour that we kind of had like penciled in to chat and everything. So I just wanted to finish it where you could announce like where you can find your work, where you can find like the research that you're doing, what's going on out in Seattle with the movement, and then allow Karl to kind of do the same thing. So if you wanted to give like a little bit of a plug for each of yourselves, and then I will let you get back to the rest of your Friday.
Cool. Oh yeah, so I've been doing I have like my public education website, which is called whatisnuclear.com. And I mentioned before, you can also get to the waste page through whataboutthewaste.com. And I've been working with some friends and colleagues on that webpage through the years since like 2006. And it's a little text heavy, but it's where we put our information. There was a time we thought, oh, if we make a webpage, everyone will learn about and love nuclear. I'm beyond thinking that that's going to have that much impact, but it's out there. So you can read a lot about like the basics and stuff that I talked about in some depth on that website. So that's a lot of fun. There are a variety of advanced nuclear companies in Seattle. There's a fusion company that's going on out in Redmond. There's Ultra Safe Nuclear Corporation, which is working on a pretty small gas-cooled reactor. And there's TerraPower, which is working on sodium-cooled liquid metal and molten salt reactors. So there's a naval shipyard near Seattle, and there's a bunch of nuclear-powered submarines, 15 miles out in the Sound out there. So there's a ton of nuclear reactors nearby. So it's definitely, there's a lot of like nuclear stuff in general. Ooh, and I guess this is worth mentioning or not, but there's one of the biggest storage facilities of thermonuclear weapons up at one of the naval sub bases 20 miles that way. So we're surrounded by nuclear technology. Anyway, and then Karl can talk about the outreach stuff.
Yeah, so I'm very happy to volunteer along with Nick for the Seattle Friends of Fission. You'll have to search for us on Facebook. I think that's our best presence. I throw up the most important nuclear news that comes to my attention on that site. And so no more than one update a day. Also, you can find my content here on Twitch at Your Environment Seattle or yestv.org from my YouTube site. I also multi-stream on dozens of platforms, either under YesTV or Thorium. And I work for a private video game company. My dad was in the nuclear industry, working at the Satsip plant, which you can drive by if you're driving out to the West Coast past Olympia. You'll see those two cooling towers where they filmed the Transformers movie. But unfortunately, that's precisely when we decided we didn't want nuclear. So I went into computer science. And I rely on, the millennials like Nick who came after me to carry the torch for nuclear engineering. I'm super excited to be involved with my local Seattle DSA, and I hope that all of you will spread the message of, energy wealth and plentiful resources to your political communities. We need to have a bright carbon-free future for the rest of humanity.
Well, I wanted to thank both you, Nick and Karl, for giving me some of your time today. I was the host, kind of just trying to think of some decent questions that audiences may want to hear about. If you wanted to find any of my stuff, it's at twitch.tv/Touring News, or on YouTube at Touring News, and Twitter at Touring News 1. So I really do thank you both for the conversation, and we will see you sometime soon.